In the first four chapters of First Peter, Peter is writing to prepare people for the persecution that is coming their way at the hands of Nero. But in chapter 5, he makes a transition. He makes a transition from offering individual instruction to people on how they need to personally prepare, and he begins talking about how the church needs to prepare. And the first thing he talks about is the crucial element of leadership and how important it is for the church to have a healthy, strong, biblical leadership as they face any struggles or troubles that might be coming their way. God's always been concerned with leadership in his church and even leadership in the Old Testament. Consider some of the great leaders of the Old Testament, like Moses, Joshua, and David, and Daniel, and Josiah. And we think of those names as men of strength and men of courage and men with great leadership abilities. But there were some men in the Old Testament that served as leaders, and we never found out their names. Their names are never even mentioned. They often sat out at the city gates and they would offer advice, they would offer biblical counsel, godly counsel, they would settle debts, they would witness legal transitions, they would announce God's blessings and warnings. They were representatives of God in the community. And although their names were never mentioned, they were given a title. And this title that they were given was elder. Isn't that interesting? We often think that the New Testament kind of corners the market on the word elder, but even in the Old Testament, there were elders. And I think it's important for us to know that, and it's important for us to understand what those elders did, because if that same terminology is being used in the church, then probably God is expecting some of the same types of things to happen from those men. God uses this terminology again in the New Testament, this word elder. And Peter refers to churches' elders as shepherds and examples, similar to the Old Testament view of an elder. And one thing we often miss when we look at this text is Peter even says that he is an elder. He's a preacher, but he is also an elder. And notice this in 1 Peter chapter 5 and beginning in verse 1, Peter's 5 short verses on leadership. To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder, a witness of Christ's sufferings, and one who will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock who is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you are willing. There's that same thing we hear so often in the qualities of elders that Timothy and Titus mention, is that desire, that willingness. But because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. All of you, clothe yourself with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Shepherds in Bible times were not people who showed up at the pasture, but and they didn't show up at the pasture and put in 8 hours and go home. There was a genuine relationship between the shepherd and his sheep. And though the time spent together and the frequent interactions, you might say, and Lynn Anderson used the term in his book years ago, you might say that shepherds in biblical times would have smelled like sheep. You see, elders are not merely people who meet a list of qualifications and are plugged into a position of authority. Elders have to have developed a heart for the sheep. And I'm not saying they develop it once they become a shepherd. I'm saying that they have already displayed shepherd-like characteristics in their service and concern for people. Often when we appoint elders, we don't really think of the shepherd part. When we start thinking about the qualities, there's often here in Churches of Christ qualifications. We mentioned desire. We mentioned that he's a husband of one wife. He can't have 3 or 4 wives at home. We mentioned that he's got to have believing children, and we argue whether that children can just be one. And it's but we don't stop and remember that one of those things, one of those qualifications to be a shepherd is to have shepherd like tendencies. Those qualities that are in those 2 passages in Timothy and Titus. Church, those aren't checklists. They're lists that don't even match in each book. So the point that Paul is trying to get across is that these need to be quality people. But most importantly, I would say that they need to be shepherds. They need to be shepherds of the people. And biblical shepherding isn't as much about, rules and regulations and whatnot, as it is really caring for and developing relationships with the sheep that are under your care. And one of the things that I've appreciated over my years in ministry is I've worked with a lot of elders, a lot of elders. And I say this with love and I say this hesitantly, but I've worked with very few true shepherds. And there's a difference. There's a difference between someone who just sits in a boardroom and makes decisions and doesn't do anything else regarding the church until 2 weeks later when he meets in that boardroom again, or maybe when he gives announcements on Sunday morning. It's deeper than that. It's developing a relationship with the people that God has entrusted to your care. And I think one of the things that hurts us in Churches of Christ is that we don't talk about this as much as we should. We beat Timothy and Titus to death talking about, the qualifications and who can be and who can't be, and especially when we're going through the elder search process, which boggles the mind. There's so many ways I've seen churches do that, but I think we need to go back to the Bible and look at that a little more, and make sure we're doing what God would want us to do in that process. It's not a popularity contest. But anyway, I've got a little off the subject there, but that's important because when it becomes a popularity contest, we're not looking at men who shepherd. We're just looking at men who maybe are good businessmen or guys who occasionally teach class. It's deeper than that. Elders are shepherds, and that's important for us to remember. Secondly, elders are examples. Elders are men who have walked the trail ahead of us and can lead us in the right direction. When Paul said that elders should be apt to teach, he wasn't just talking about Bible class on Sunday morning, as those were not invented yet. The idea of teaching in this context has to do more with mentoring and equipping. Peter referred to elders as examples to the flock. The greatest teaching that an elder can do is not in a Sunday morning Bible class. The greatest teaching, and the teaching, that more of the teaching that elders should be doing is providing a positive message, showing us the way to Jesus through their example. You know, elders are also called, according to Ephesians 4:11 through 12, to equip the church for works of ministry. You see, elders provide a service for people through one-on-one teaching opportunities. They help individuals discover and develop their spiritual gifts. They guide individuals to areas of ministry and match their gifts and their passion with them and their tools and skills needed to excel. And I'm not talking about in a classroom, in a equipping men for service class, or in a a new converts class. I'm not talking about that. Go back, elders or shepherds. I'm talking about in one-on-one mentoring relationships. And you might say, well, we've got a congregation of 400 people and we only have 2 elders. Then that's a problem. That means your first priority as elders is to begin training and equipping more elders. Because, if you have a congregation of 100 people, very often you'll see churches with 2 or 3 elders. That's not enough. Because how many people can you truly take under your wing to try to equip and mentor? And maybe not everyone needs it. You might have some older people in the congregation that have been Christians for 60 years, and they still serve and they do their thing, and they're well-rounded and they're good. But I think one of the reasons that so many young people, for instance, fall away from the church when they go to college is because what we've done, and I'm not against youth ministry, but what elderships have done is they've hired youth ministers and said, here, you mentor the kids. You can hire a youth minister to do events with the kids, to teach them, to have Bible class with them, and take them on mission trips. But if you're a shepherd of God's flock, the mentoring of those young people's Christian minds is still up to you. It's still your responsibility, along with the minister, along with the elders, along with the teachers. It is your responsibility. And it's important to remember that whether shepherding, mentoring, or equipping, again, elders do their best work through relationships. An elder is known by the credibility of his walk with God and the genuineness of his service. And this example can only be seen in his relationship with the sheep. And like I was saying earlier, and I got off on a little tangent, and I'm not even sure I finished. Like I was saying earlier, I've worked with so many elders over the years, and they'll sit in their boardroom every 2 weeks and they'll talk, and they might shake some hands after church. But that's about the extent of their eldering. And I think Peter would pull that elder aside and say, you're not an elder. You're not a shepherd. You're an administrator. And if you want to be administrator, great. That's a deacon position and you can do that. But that's what happens so often in churches is you have the preacher doing the work of the elders, which is visiting hospitals and helping people in times of need. And that I love doing that. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy that part of ministry. But shepherds, y'all need to beat me to the hospital, because really that's part of your responsibility. So we have ministers doing the work of elders, elders doing the work of deacons and showing up at administrative meetings, and then deacons, wearing a title and maybe setting up tables in the fellowship hall for a fellowship. And there's something about that that's just not up to the standard that Peter's talking about in this text. An important thing we talk about quite often, and I'm going to wrap up with this, is who can be an elder? And when churches study this, when churches study who can be an elder, they often study the qualification passages in First Timothy and Titus that I mentioned earlier. And although these passages certainly need to be studied, we never need to neglect the one we read just now, and that is, 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Because in this text, Peter uses three terms that define an elder. And before anyone is ever appointed an elder or a shepherd in the church, it should be determined that these three terms describe the man who is being considered. Why? Because it's possible. Now hear me out here. It is possible for someone to be the husband of one wife and have believing children and still not gifted to serve as an elder. It's very important to understand. Even Romans 12 talks about eldership as a spiritual gift. Someone may do the checklists in those passages just fine, but still not have the gift of leadership. Well, the first term Peter uses is the Greek word presbytero. Say that three times real fast. I can't say it one time real fast. Presbytero. And this refers to older ones who lead by experience. The more life experience that someone has, it also encompasses their spiritual experience. And this would fit into what Paul told Timothy. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil, 1 Timothy 3:6. Now, so the first word, Greek word, is presbytero. The second word is pomenio. That one's a little bit easier, and that's a metaphor which usually is translated into the English as pastor. However, a more literal translation would be shepherd. That's what pastor means, is shepherd. And many religious groups refer to their ministers as pastors, but if we examine the context of how this is used in the Bible, it's talking about shepherds, and it's talking about there being a plurality of them in each congregation. And then the third word is episcopo, not Joe Piscopo, but episcopo, which is a descriptive word and is most commonly translated as bishops or overseers. However, the word overseer finds its roots more commonly in 17th century church hierarchy than in the New Testament. A more accurate translation of episcopo, even though we've started saying it means overseers, would be caretakers, or those who take care of the flock, those who watch the flock. The literal meaning of that word is those who watch on behalf of. Think about that. Those who watch on behalf of. It almost sounds like a babysitter, doesn't it? And I've heard elders say before, well, I'm not a babysitter. Well, yeah, you are. In one sense, you really are. You are sitting, you are watching babes in Christ, and you are trying to help them grow into spiritually mature Christians. So Peter is writing this to remind the elders whom he's writing to that the strength of the church's survival depends on their leadership. Churches have to be incredibly cautious when appointing elders to ensure the candidates both meet the qualifications and, as I mentioned earlier, also are gifted to lead. Again, Romans chapter 12, verses 4 through 8, and Paul's list of gifts that God gives to the church leadership is listed as one of the gifts. It's possible for someone to have a strong Christian character like we see described in Timothy and Titus, and still not be gifted with the ability to lead. I didn't understand that when I was a young minister. We were first congregation I worked for. We didn't have elders, and I was talking to one of the men about being an elder and thinking we could appoint elders. And I remember talking to him on his front porch, and he said, "Well, I may meet those qualities in Timothy and Titus, and if I was gifted to lead, I would have the desire to do so. But that's just not my talent, and that's just not my gift." I didn't get that as a young minister. I was like, "Well, I don't it must be because you meet the checklist." It doesn't mean that they're talented to serve as a leader just because they meet the checklist. But I want you to notice one other thing before I wrap up, and I realize I've said a lot about shepherds today, but this chapter in the book that I wrote is called Shepherds and Sheep. You see, Peter talks a little bit about sheep as well when he calls young men to be subject to the elders. The Hebrew writer makes a similar statement when he says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable to you." Elders have a difficult task. And that's why it's important that the right people are appointed. It's a difficult task of watching over souls in their flock. Paul and the Hebrew writer encourage Christians to follow their shepherds. Let me tell you something. Shepherding should be a joy. Now, I know there's some elders out there that just laughed out loud, so I'm giving you a chance to pull it together. Shepherding should be a joy. But for many elders, it's not. My dad's been an elder as long as I can remember. And he's called me. I mean, I remember when I was a kid and he'd come home upset about something that someone said at church or someone was doing at church or I mean, when I was really, really young, I remember my dad coming home on a Sunday night, and I was told to go to my room, and I didn't know what was going on, and I snuck out and I listened, and he was out there with the preacher and another elder, and they had come over to the house to get my dad because they were going to see someone because a wife had murdered her husband in the church. And I just can't. I mean, wow. It is not always a joyous experience, but that's that shouldn't be. We are often unaware of the grief that some Christians cause elders. This occurs when we don't follow their example of godly living, when we don't support the programs they implement for the spiritual growth of the church, and when we view them as the complaint department, which, come on, let's be real now, we do. Often when we walk up to an elder, we say, "I want to talk to you about something," and it's something we don't like. You ever walked up to an elder and said, "I want to talk to you about how I can get more involved in the church and how I can be a better Christian"? That's one of the best things you could ever say to a shepherd of God's flock. You will turn their grief to joy if you support them and pray for them and let them help you use the spiritual gifts that God has entrusted to you for the growth and the edification of the church. But this has got to come back to the elders for just a minute. And if you have someone in your church who is gifted to do something, it's up to you to make sure they do it, that you find out what their spiritual giftedness is. You know, I've been in churches before where we've done renovations and we've had work to be done around the church, and maybe we were getting ready to have I remember one time specifically, we were getting ready to have a work day on a Saturday, and I walked into the auditorium on a Thursday, and two of the elders were in there painting it. And I said, I thought we were doing this Saturday. And they said, oh, we thought we'd just go ahead and do this part. I said, well, are you not going to be here Saturday? Oh, we'll be here. I said, then put the brushes down. We have men who are, I'm surprised I didn't get in trouble for that, but I was trying to make a point, and I just said, put the brushes down. We've got so many men that are going to be here on Saturday, and we need to allow them to serve in a way that they can. They may not be able to do the things you guys do spiritually, but they can pick up a paintbrush. So allow people to use their gifts and talents. Allow the women in your church to use their gifts and talents. Allow them to lead Bible studies and be more involved in the work of the church. You know, several years ago, when my dad was asked to present a lesson on a lectureship in our fellowship about leadership, he was given the title, What Brethren Wish Elders Knew About Leadership. And I remember my dad telling me that his research for this lesson was quite an eye-opener, and he thinks it made him a better elder. What brethren wish elders knew about leadership. So he researched and he did a survey, and he asked members from different congregations what the elders wish they knew about leadership. And here are some of the most common answers that he received. We wish elders knew the word. We wish elders knew how to communicate with the congregation. We wish the elders knew the difference between leading and directing. We wish elders knew that a big part of leadership is trust. We wish elders knew that elders have elders too. That's important, isn't it? We wish elders knew that their job primarily was to shepherd. We wish elders knew how to delegate responsibility. We just talked about that. We wish elders truly knew their congregation. Answers like this are common because in some congregations, elders take more of a board of directors approach than the approach of spiritual leadership, spiritual mentorship, and example. Yet if Peter's description of eldership was followed, these type of answers would be far less common. But we must remember that even the most effective elders can only be as effective as the sheep allow them to be.